Returning to our top story, this flood emergency in New South Wales. Let's go to the New South Wales Operations Centre at Sydney Olympic Park, where we find the Emergency Management Minister, Murray Watt. Murray Watt, thanks for joining us. You've just had briefings there, as I understand it.
G'day, Andrew, good to be with you.
How is this flood looking compared to the February and March events in New South Wales?
Yeah, Andrew, one of the really concerning things about this is that depending on which area you're looking at, particularly around the Hawkesbury Nepean, it's very comparable to the water levels and the flood levels that we saw in the floods in that exact region earlier this year, and even in some parts approaching the levels that were recorded early last year. So we have seen already some very severe flooding, particularly in the Hawkesbury Nepean River, on several occasions over the last 18 months, and unfortunately it looks like we're back at those levels. So I really feel for the people who live in those regions. They've been through so much, and of course in some places those floods came on the back of the Black Summer bushfires as well. So people are going through a lot, and it's important that they know that we're all standing with them at this time. Have
you had a report on this cargo ship that's adrift? Could there be some defence assistance there? What's the plan in relation to those 21 crew members?
Yeah, that was certainly one of the concerning things that happened today, Andrew, and my understanding is that in some ways this wasn't weather related. The ship has simply broken down, but obviously it's in the middle of pretty difficult weather. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority is coordinating this, and that sits with my colleague Catherine King in terms of responsibility, but I have been briefed about this, and it looks like the situation is now under control. My understanding is that Defence Force resources have been deployed to assist stabilise that ship, as well as water police as well. The latest update that I have is that people do think that we'll be able to manage the situation reasonably well, stabilise the ship. At this point, as far as I'm aware, the crew remain on board, and that has been judged the safest place for them to be. But of course, if things were to turn for the worst, then evacuations would be considered. But at this point of time, it looks like people have been able to manage that situation and stabilise things, which is a good thing to hear.
All right, and you've got defence assistance in there pretty quickly. We've seen vehicles, we've seen pictures of vehicles driving through floodwater. I've seen today. What can you tell us about what Defence are doing and how that assistance might even be lifted or increased?
Yeah, Andrew, we've made a really conscious effort this time in combination with the New South Wales Government to make sure that we had defence resources deployed at an early stage. And I want to commend both federal and state government agencies for the cooperation that they've shown leading up to this event, which meant that we were able to get those resources out quickly. So on Friday night, I and the Defence Forces approved a request from the New South Wales Government for 2 specialist helicopters available for nighttime missions and also 100 troops. And those troops have been out over the last couple of days doing sandbagging and evacuations and things like that. Yesterday afternoon, we approved a further request from the New South Wales Government for an additional 100 troops, and they're now available at 24 hours notice should the New South Wales Government require them. At this point in time, we haven't heard of any further requests that will be made, but of course we would listen carefully to what the New South Wales Government asks of us going forward.
How bad could this get, Murray Watt?
Well, the latest information I've had, Andrew, is that in most places the floodwaters have peaked, and that's a good thing, obviously. There's still a few areas that we're keeping a bit of an eye on just to make sure that the flood rivers don't rise any further. And I think if we can make it through till tomorrow morning without any more flood waters rising, then I think hopefully that means that we're starting to move through. But even over the next few days, we are expecting some more rainy weather, both in the Greater Sydney and Hunter region, potentially some more in the Northern Rivers as well, which is obviously a worry given the recovery work that's still going on there. So hopefully we're through the worst of it in terms of the Hawkesbury Nepean region and Greater Sydney in general. But of course, what lies ahead then is the cleanup effort. And again, this is something that people in that region have had to do so many times. It's amazing they keep on going, and that's where they'll need to make sure that all governments and all communities are standing with them, and we certainly will be.
Do you have a view on the proposal to lift the Warragamba Dam wall?
No, I don't, Andrew. I mean, I know that it is an issue that gets debated every time we see one of these events. And of course, ultimately, that is a decision for the New South Wales government because it is their dam and they have the management operations of that. And what I am aware of is that there are very strong views about this on both sides of the debate. I know that there are people who are big advocates of raising the dam wall, but equally I know there are a lot of people who oppose it, and not just for environmental reasons, but also because of the risk that water actually remains in a region longer if it isn't able to run off more quickly. So it's a difficult issue. There's very strong views about it, but we see it as something that really is a state government issue to be determined. Sure.
What would your advice be for people living in some of these flood-prone areas? We've seen these continuing problems in Lismore. Now it's the Hawkesbury Nepean as well. I mean, this is kind of a blunt, maybe it's a stupid question, but should people just look to move?
Look, I wouldn't sort of go as far as saying that should happen in all cases, Andrew. I mean, I do think what we need to do as a community is look at what we can do to mitigate or reduce the impacts of these kinds of disasters in areas that are already developed. I mean, it's no easy thing to simply relocate an entire community of tens of thousands of people. In my home state of Queensland, there's often examples pointed to places like Grantham, west of Brisbane in the Lockyer Valley, which suffered badly in the 2011 floods, and most of the homes there have been relocated. But that's a pretty small town, and it's a different kind of thing to, Windsor, Richmond, those developed areas in Western Sydney. So I think when it comes to existing locations, what we've got to look at carefully is disaster mitigation, and that's why we made an election commitment to significantly increase investment from a federal level in disaster mitigation compared to what we've seen before. But of course, I do also think that we need to have some very sensible discussions and sensible rules about where new development occurs, because, if we're thinking about where we're placing new development, we need to take into account flood risks, bushfire risks when it comes to those sorts of approvals. And I'm sure that's something that we'll be talking about with state governments and local governments going forward.
And how much of this do you pin on climate change, or is it just a weather system in La Niña?
Well, of course, the direct result is from La Niña, but I don't think that we can pretend that we aren't seeing more of these events because of climate change. I mean, if we need evidence that climate change is here, all we've got to do is look out the window in places like Sydney, the Illawarra and the Hunter right now, or those bushfire areas that we saw. I mean, I think the fact that we are seeing these kinds of natural disasters happen at such a scale, so frequently in so many different parts of the country, is a sign that things are changing. And that's why we need to change. It's why we need to take serious action about climate change so that we don't see the scale of these events increase even further. But it's also why we need to take strong measures now to adapt to the climate change that has already happened. And that's, again, why we need to be seeing some investment in disaster mitigation, especially at the federal level.
Just on that, you made some moves on the weekend to reform your portfolio. Shane Stone loses his job. You amalgamated the National Resilience Agency with Emergency Management Australia. And you're going to move on this emergency response fund. Why have you made these changes? And even if you spend all the $200 million on flood and fire mitigation and the like that you're getting in interest from this fund, don't we actually need the $4 billion capital in this fund to be spent on this sort of mitigation?
Well, you're right, Andrew. We have made some significant structural changes to the federal disaster agencies quite quickly on taking office. And that's because we went to the election saying that we needed to be much better prepared as a country for the natural disasters, which we are going to see in increasing proportions. And part of that is about making the structural changes at the federal level to make sure that we've got the best systems and the best organisations to deal with these disasters. And what we've done by announcing that we will be amalgamating the federal government's resilience agency with its immediate response agency is that we will now have one coordinated agency at a federal level that will manage natural disasters, from preparing for them to responding to them and then recovering from them and building resilience into the future. In terms of the funding, you're right, we did again go to the election with a commitment to overhaul Scott Morrison's total failure of an emergency response fund. which all it really did was accrue interest for the government rather than building disaster projects or spending money on recovery. What we've said we will do is convert that into a dedicated disaster-ready fund that will invest up to $200 million a year in flood levies, drainage systems, bushfire evacuations, things like that. And hopefully we can get that money matched by state and territory governments as well to double the size of that pot. The reason we don't intend to spend the capital of that fund is that it effectively has been set up as part of the overall future fund. And the idea there is that you put some money away and invest it so that you generate an investment return every year, and that's what you spend. Of course, if you go and spend all the money, then you've got nothing left to come in year by year. But even in increasing the investment to $200 million a year at the federal level is a big increase on what we've seen before. And if it can be matched by states and territories, that will really start making some inroads into the backlog of mitigation projects that we see right around the country.
Murray Watt, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.